Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad al-Fatih lima ughliq al-khatim lima sabaq nasir al-haqqi bil-haqq wal-hadi ila siratika al-mustaqim wa ala alihi haqqa qadrihi wa miqdarihi al-azim. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا فعلمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. SubhanAllah, we're in our final session for this Ramadan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the blessings of these final days that are before us, ahead of us, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept everything that has passed. Inshallah, today we'll close with our final session on the notion of ghurur or self-delusion that we've been covering over the past few weeks on these Tuesdays. And we had begun in the last session, the previous session, in looking at one of the types of people who can fall prey to self-delusion, to deception, people who possess knowledge. Today, we're going to wrap up by looking at a few other categories. And the point of this is not just to create categorizations so that we can walk around in the world, look at other people and say, I wonder what category that person falls into. But rather for us to look inwardly at ourselves and to think as we hear about these different types of people in the way that perhaps they might become self-deluded. They might fall into self-deception, ghurur. We think, well, what of these qualities and character traits might I identify in my own thoughts, in my own soul, in my own behavior? So we begin then with the first of the remaining three categories today. We'll treat them all very quickly. The very first of today's then are people who dedicate themselves to ibadah, to worship, and to other forms of pious actions. Now here, by way of example, Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he gives examples of people who are particularly dedicated to prayers. Let's say praying in the front row of the mosque, all of their 5 daily prayers for the men, or standing up, men and women alike, at night prayers. Or people who are particularly dedicated to the recitation of the Quran. Or people who go on a lot of umrahs, for example. Or other forms of ibadah. So here, the danger in all of this, as he highlights to us, is that the person may come to place their very trust in the action rather than on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the actions become, in a sense, an end rather than a means unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure. Furthermore, in such a case, the person starts to think that their salvation, and this is a very dangerous turning point in the spiritual psychology of the human being, the person comes to think that their salvation is in their actions rather than in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the actions just become a human habit on the one hand, and the person's sense of their value for the akhirah, for eternity, becomes predicated not upon fear and hope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acceptance or mercy or clemency towards one's good actions and towards those things that we fall short on, but simply they're a bit like bankers who count out the notes and they say, well, this is my share. This is what I've accomplished. This is what I've done. And as you've noticed in all of those sentences, the word I, the self, the nafs, is the centerpiece. So we are commended then not to allow ourselves to become self-deluded that we are something and I am someone because I pray in the front row. You pray in the front row because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has graced you with that ability. Had Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused any one of us to be fallen with a severe illness, we wouldn't be able to get out of bed, let alone out of the house, let alone into the mosque, let alone into the front row. And so we don't place our sense of value in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of this mere action. Rather, the correct attitude is to be grateful to Allah for the blessing of being able to stand in that front row. Or, for example, to pray at night, or to fast extra nawafil fasts, or any of the types of pious actions that sometimes people become self-deluded because of. Okay? So the point of all of this, then, is to make sure that our hearts are not attached to our actions, but rather the hearts must continue to be attached only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Now, just be mindful that everything I'm saying is not to diminish the act of, let's say, for men of standing in praying in the mosque, or for anyone to pray night prayers, or any of these other pious actions. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as narrated from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a hadith Qudsi, says that there is nothing better for those who want to draw near to Allah, to me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaking in the first person, than performing what I have obligated upon them. So one begins with the obligations and goes on, of course, as the hadith continues, to the supererogatory, the nawafil acts, that by means of which one draws closer and closer to Allah, but with one very important proviso, which is that we place our trust in Allah and not in the actions. We thank Allah that He manifested these actions on our limbs. Okay? And furthermore, just to close on this point, as Imam Ghazali also enjoins upon us, that we don't just mutter our way through the prayer, or just up and down and, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and to the right and to the left, giving our closing greetings, or just go through the motions, but rather in any spiritual act, we give it its haqq. Because the point is not just to belt out prayers or days of fasting or just to give money. The point is to do so in a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves and will be pleasing to Him. Okay? So, this is the people who turn to their actions and might become beholden to their pious actions. The next category, the third of the four, the second for today, are the people of spirituality, or what he calls translated as the would-be Sufis. Okay? And he says, we find a lot of people who are self-deluded. Okay, in this category. Because in his age, and we see some of this even to our age today, where people then, when they take a spiritual path, or they decide to take their spirituality in Islam very seriously, sometimes become fixated on their clothing. So they wear the quote-unquote garb, the due of the Sufis. Okay? Or they like to quote things that are kind of incomprehensible to most people, and to be honest with you, probably incomprehensible to them. They might act in certain ways, long beards and long tasbihs, all of which is mubah, but then they're not paying attention to the fact that their tongues are very long in speaking about other people. They're making claims, in other words, in their outward comportment and their clothing and their behavior that doesn't actually match with their inward reality. They're claiming to talk about things of spiritual realization where, may Allah protect us from this, they don't even have the slightest whiff of this. And it can go beyond this. In some cases in history, and even until today, there are people who claim to be upon the spiritual path of tasawwuf, of Islam, and yet they don't even bother with the basic actions. They don't push themselves. There's no mujahadat an-nafs, struggling against the lower self, of the form that we saw with the scholars of tasawwuf of the very earliest generations, themselves taking their cue from the tabi'een and from the sahaba and from the Prophet himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rather, you find some people who claim to be people of tasawwuf or of Islamic spirituality, and they abandon actions. They say, well, I'm now at a spiritual situation where I don't need to do all those things that everyday people do. In some extreme cases in the past, thankfully this is relatively rare these days, but it does exist. They might even say, I don't even need to do the fard prayers anymore because the prayer is just a means and God is the end. These words are true in their outward form, but their meaning as they intended are completely batil and false and void. Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the end, and Allah commands towards something, even if it's a means, we honor it because of who has commanded it. And we practice it and we implement it in our lives as a way of pleasing our Creator and our existentiator and our Maker. So if such people actually had real understanding of the spiritual stations such as zuhd, as abstinence, or of tawakkul, reliance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they wouldn't sit there and just focus on these outward things. Well, I only ate one meal every 3 days. This might be good, and this might be meaningless. For some people, eating one meal every 3 days is a way to control their lower selves, usually under the direction of a spiritual guide or something of the sort. For other people, it's just a waste of time. It might even be harmful to their health and thus to their dunya and to their akhirah. Again, these aren't things that we make up as we go along, and there's absolutely no space for pride in any such actions. And so here, once again, we need to be careful of the types of self-delusions that when we look at the really masters of our spiritual tradition, such as whom? Such as the Sahaba who were trained by the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sahbihi wasallam, we saw how they stuck to both the outward and to the inward together. They never divorced the two. They had the best reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they would take provisions with them when they traveled, for example. They would go with very little, and at other times they would feast. In other words, they didn't take the outward forms of things to be causes of a self-identity where people feel important because look how spiritual I am, look how I'm dressed, look who my sheikh is. In fact, the greatest of the sheikhs of tasawwuf, of the spiritual path, well into our own times, one of the sheikhs of Damascus, for example, of the 20th century, used to forbid his students from even mentioning his name so they don't fall into a sense of pride or a false, again, self-delusion that somehow they're better than others because of who their sheikh is. We're not here to form little cliques. The point of the tasawwuf and of the masters, of the shuyukh, and having communities that travel the spiritual path together is to be a mutual aid, and that those who have been granted something by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Najiyu, takes the hand of their brother. So, he says these are some of the self-delusions of the people who claim falsely to tasawwuf. And so again, we take this as a model, and we, instead of pointing our fingers outward, we look and say, well, maybe some of these things that we've just heard about, I have, and I need to be careful about. It doesn't require that a person claims to be a Sufi to be sometimes self-deluded by their actions and or their behaviors. The final and fourth category of the four, the third of today, then are the people of wealth, the rich, people who have money, people who have resources, material resources that perhaps others don't. So you'll find people of wealth who are very keen to build mosques or to build schools or hospitals. And of course, these actions are praiseworthy and meritorious actions. But at times you'll find people who, in so doing, there seems that their primary concern, as Imam Ghazali also highlights, is to inscribe their names in baked bricks or in plaques on these buildings so that their memory is immortalized and everybody can sit there and say, wow, look what that person did. In our own day and age, an age of digital social media, You'll find people who are broadcasting every few minutes sometimes on Instagram or on other social media their pious acts, showing to the world, this is a mosque I've built. This is an orphanage that I've built. Look how I'm feeding the people, the poor people in this area. Now, here we need to be careful. Again, not to pass judgment on people who do this, because it might be that they're doing so in order to encourage others, to show that this is a blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by means of so doing, to encourage. But there's no doubt that for many of us, these might be forms, again, of self-delusion and of self-importance. So we need to be careful. When Allah grants us wealth, and we then claim to be using this wealth for pious ends, for ends that will be pleasing to Allah, we need to be careful. Is this wealth, first of all, acquired by lawful means or by injustices, by prohibited things, by unethical things such as bribery or going into shady business practices or taking an extra cut that nobody was looking, and so I might as well just let myself in on it. Rather, instead of boasting and thinking, now I'm going to build a madrasa on the back of this illegal wealth, immoral, unethical wealth, what we should be doing is tawbah. The other thing to be careful about, that Imam Ghazali points out, is that many people think themselves to be sincere, but if they're then asked to do something where maybe there's no showing off, there's no name to be written on a plaque anywhere, there's no Instagram to be posted to about it, they don't bite, they don't take it, they don't do it. And again, this is something where we're not here to wag our fingers at others about, but to reflect. Perhaps I've fallen into this, that I find it easy or maybe even pleasurable to spend of my wealth when others are noticing, or ways that will bring me recognition and name. And in other moments, when nobody's going to notice, then I'm a bit slack. Or maybe I just do the minimal if I do anything at all. So in all of these forms, we need to be careful, again, of this ghurur, of this falling into self-delusion. And so with all of these matters, we need to be careful that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted our wealth, what is the cure from this self-delusion? To realize exactly that. It's Allah who has given us this wealth. And so when we are giving it to the poor or to build a mosque, we're not doing anyone any favors other than our own selves, because we're using the blessing of Allah in a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants it to be used in. Not for self-aggrandizement, not for our own pleasures, not in order to burnish our names and make them shine bright for posterity. So for decades people will talk about the amazing thing that I did. But rather, if Allah has granted us the wealth, then the only ultimate benefit of it, as the Prophet taught when he told one of his wives once, that what you've given away is what you've really kept forever. Because when you give something away, that will stay with Allah for eternity for us to see in the akhirah, and that is the true and real success of that which we will keep. So we have to be careful then of all the types of stinginess, of haughtiness, of a sense of pride that comes with wealth, because thus even pious acts only possible through wealth can lead us down the path of self-delusion. So in closing, one might rightly ask, Tayyib, this basically covers everyone and everything. And maybe I'm feeling a little bit of despair now that how am I ever going to get out of this trap of self-delusion and its defects? And the answer to this is that one should never despair in the mercy of Allah. When a person finds things too big, whatever it is in life, too difficult, too challenging, then the answer to this is to say, "Oh Allah, I am faqir, I am in utter neediness of you. I'm incapable. I can't manage this on my own. But there is nothing, O Allah, that is too hard for you. There is nothing that you can't effect if you will it. And so it's for us to turn back to Allah. If we identify some of these traits and characteristics in ourselves, to turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in tawbah, and to turn our azam, our resolve, towards matters of the akhirah and the things that will aid us in what is pleasing to Allah for eternity in the akhirah. Does this mean that I don't take any attention to matters of my dunya? No, it doesn't mean this. It means that you take a measure that I'll do things of the dunya when they help me towards my akhirah in a way that is pleasing to Allah. And anything else, I'll give it a miss. Anything else, I'll ask for Allah's help in getting rid of these forms of self-delusion that we've recounted and that we have reflected upon. So in all of this requires ilm. Ilm, knowledge, true knowledge founded upon the revelation, the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. This is what gives us that objective measure of what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and how to identify if we've fallen into self-delusion. And this is one of the best reasons for reading works like Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulum al-Din, or for example the Riyad al-Salihin of Imam Nawawi, and other similar works that have been organized in a way that by reflecting upon the Quran, the words of the Prophet, and the statements of the awliya and the ulama, we might be able to come to a better understanding of our very own selves. And if this proves too challenging, then one finds a guide. One finds someone who can help, because it's very hard sometimes to diagnose from within your own self. It's much easier for when the sight is from the outside, when somebody's looking at it from the outside. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us tawfiq, that we not fall into any of these self-delusions, we not fall into the traps of deception that the shaitan sets for us, and that we are able to use these remaining days and hours of Ramadan, and well beyond them, the remaining days and hours of our lives, because none of us know whether we'll be here for the next Ramadan or not. We use these days in order to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in sincerity and in reflection upon our very own self-delusions and deceptions, and ask Him, He who never turns anyone away who comes to Him in sincerity, to help us to overcome them. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. May Allah accept from us one and all our fast and our standing and our prayers. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.